Garrett did not look like a man who had once been called one of the best soldiers in the Terran Coalition. He looked like exactly what he was now, a man the galaxy had thrown away. His boots were cracked at the soles. His armor was old, the Coalition markings scratched off with a knife on the day they exiled him. His face was rough with weeks of unshaved growth, and his eyes carried the kind of quiet that only comes from spending too much time alone. He walked with a slight lean to the left, where an old wound had never fully healed, and he carried a pack on his back that held everything he owned in the world: a blade, a small medkit, 3 ration bars, a fire starter, and a canteen that needed refilling. That was it. That was all of Garrett. Voron 9 was not a place anyone chose to go. It was a place people got sent when someone powerful decided they were no longer useful. The planet sat at the far edge of settled space, cold and gray and ugly, with a sky that never quite managed to be blue. The wind came in hard from the northern flats most of the day, carrying small particles of frozen dirt that stung the skin. The ground was rocky and uneven, full of deep cracks and dead plant matter that crunched under boots like old bones. There were other exiles on Voron 9, maybe 200 of them scattered across the Badlands in small camps, but Garrett kept away from them. He had learned early that the kind of people who ended up on exile planets were not always the kind of people worth knowing. He had been there for 4 months. He spent his days doing what survivors do. He checked his traps in the morning, simple wire snares he had rigged along the small creature trails near his camp. He collected ice from the shadowed rock faces and melted it for water. He walked the land in widening circles each day, learning it, mapping it in his head the way a soldier maps a battlefield. He did not do this because anyone told him to. He did it because moving kept him from thinking too much, and thinking too much on Voron 9 was dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with predators. He thought about the day they stripped his rank sometimes despite trying not to. He had been standing in a gray room on a gray ship with 3 Coalition officers behind a table. They read the charges in flat voices. Insubordination. Refusal of a direct order in an active combat zone. The order had been simple: fire on the coordinates given. What the coordinates held was a transport ship packed with 600 civilian refugees trying to flee a conflict zone. Garrett had looked at his commanding officer and said no. Just that. No. They had given him one chance to reconsider. He had not reconsidered. And so here he was on a gray planet, alone, with cracked boots and 3 ration bars. He did not regret it. He just tried not to think about it too much. On the morning of his 119th day on Voron 9, Garrett's routine took him further south than he had gone before. He had been working his way toward a ridge line he could see from his camp, a long dark spine of rock that cut across the landscape about 2 hours of walking from where he slept. He wanted to see what was on the other side of it. High ground always told you things. What was moving? What was avoiding the area? Where water might collect. A soldier's habits did not leave a man just because the war was over. The climb up the ridge was harder than it looked. The rock was loose and uneven, and the wind pushed at him the whole way up like it was trying to make a point. He moved slowly, testing each foothold, and reached the top breathing harder than he would have liked. He stopped. Below him, tucked between the ridge and a second wall of rock, was a valley. It was not large, maybe 300 meters across at its widest, but compared to the gray flatness of the Badlands around it, it looked almost sheltered. The rock walls cut the wind. There were patches of dark scrubby growth along the valley floor. And at the center of it, half hidden in the shadow of an overhanging rock face, was a nest. Garrett had seen pictures of Dracari nests in Coalition intelligence files. He recognized it immediately. It was enormous, a wide circle of packed earth, broken rock, and what looked like processed fiber material the Dracari carried with them across the stars to line their nesting sites. The nest was maybe 8 meters across. It was clearly very old. The materials at the outer edge had compacted and darkened over what must have been many years. He stood on the ridge and looked down at it for a long time before he moved. He came down the inside slope carefully, one hand on the rock wall, watching the valley floor as he descended. It was only when he got closer that he saw the shape at the side of the nest, large, dark, and completely still. The mother. She was massive, the way all adult Dracari were massive, with scales the color of old charcoal and wings folded tight against her sides. She had died at the edge of her own nest. Whatever had happened to her, and from the look of the deep marks across her side, something large had fought her. She had made it back here before the end. She had come back to her nest. Garrett stood beside her for a moment with his hat in his hands, not quite sure why, and then he moved to look inside the nest. 2 hatchlings. They were small, barely the size of a large dog, and they were in bad shape. Their scales had a dull, dry look that suggested they had not fed in days. One of them, dark green with pale patches along its spine, was lying on its side and breathing in a way that was too shallow and too fast. The other, darker, almost black, was sitting upright but barely. Its eyes were open but unfocused, and it did not react when Garrett's shadow fell across it. In the warmest center of the nest, half buried in the fiber lining, was a third egg, still sealed, still whole, faintly warm to the touch when Garrett reached in carefully and pressed his palm against it. He pulled his hand back and stood up straight. He looked at the two hatchlings that were barely alive. He looked at the egg that might still have a chance. He looked at the mother lying still at the edge of the nest she had died trying to reach. He thought about his situation in a practical way, the way a soldier thinks. He had 3 ration bars. He had a medkit designed for human biology. He had no way to contact anyone, no ship, no communication device that reached further than the small coalition emergency beacon in his pack. And that beacon, if activated, would bring a coalition arrest team, not a rescue team. He was one man, exiled, forgotten, with no medical training beyond field basics and no knowledge of Dracari biology beyond what little he had read in old intelligence files. There was no logical reason to stay. He thought about the 600 people on that transport ship. He thought about the officers behind the table reading charges in flat voices. He thought about what it meant to be the only one standing between something small and helpless and whatever was coming next. He took his pack off his back and set it on the ground. He pulled out his med kit and opened it on the rock beside the nest. He looked at the shallow-breathing hatchling and thought carefully about what he knew: heat, fluids, keeping airways clear. He did not know if any of it would work on a Dracari. He was going to try anyway. He pulled out his fire starter and looked at the valley walls, calculating where he could build a heat source without drawing too much attention from the ridge line. He looked at the sealed egg and mentally measured how much warmth he could maintain through the night. Then he got to work. He did not announce it to anyone. He did not make a speech about it, even inside his own head. He just knelt down in the dirt beside a dying alien hatchling on a planet that had been chosen specifically for the purpose of making people disappear, and he opened his medkit and he started doing what he could. He had no orders. He had no reason. He had no reward waiting anywhere. He just could not walk away from something small that was still trying to breathe. The first night was the hardest. Garrett had no way of knowing if what he was doing would help or make things worse. He had a medkit built for human soldiers. Bandages, antiseptic, a small injection kit, a thermal blanket, 2 packets of electrolyte powder, and a handheld light. None of it was made for a creature with scales and claws and lungs the size of his torso. But he worked with what he had, the way he had always worked, carefully, quietly, without panic. He wrapped the thermal blanket around the worst of the 2 hatchlings, the one breathing too fast and lying on its side. He did not try to move it much. He just tucked the blanket around its body, leaving its head free, and sat close so his own body heat added to the warmth. He kept his hand resting lightly on its side so he could feel every breath. Too fast, but there. Still there. He talked to it in a low voice while he sat, not saying anything meaningful, just keeping a steady sound in the air so it knew something living was nearby. Around midnight the breathing slowed down. Not stopped. Slowed. Steadied. Garrett let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for hours. By morning the hatchling had lifted its head. It was a small thing, just a hatchling raising its head a few inches off the nest floor and blinking its pale yellow eyes at the human sitting beside it. But Garrett felt something loosen in his chest when it happened, something tight that had been there since the night before. He looked at the small creature looking at him and he said quietly, "There you go." He named it Pip. He was not sure why that name, it just came out when he said it and it fit somehow. Small. Scrappy. Still here when it had no real reason to be. The second hatchling, the dark one, was steadier but quieter. It sat in the nest and watched Garrett with careful, intelligent eyes, not approaching but not pulling away either. It ate a small piece of dried ration bar he left near it on the second day, just sniffed it for a long time and then ate it in one quick movement like it did not want him to see it being hungry. He named that one Flint. Art. Reserved. But still in there. The sealed egg stayed warm at the center of the nest. Every night, Garrett built a careful ring of small fires around it using dried plant matter he collected from the valley floor. He kept the fires low, enough for heat, not enough to be seen from the ridge. He sat between the fires and the egg like a wall and fed the flames through the dark hours, sleeping in short bursts with one ear open. It was not good sleep. It was soldier sleep, the kind where the body rests but the mind stays half awake, listening. On the 4th day, Garrett rationed what was left of his food and faced the reality of his situation. He needed to eat. That meant leaving the valley to check his snare lines, which were 2 hours north. It meant leaving Pip and Flint and the egg alone in the nest, which meant they were unprotected. He looked at the valley walls and spent a morning building simple tripwire alarms from wire he stripped off the bottom of his pack frame. Nothing that would stop a large predator but enough to wake him if one came near. He set them at the 2 entry points of the valley, tied them to small stacks of loose rocks that would clatter down when disturbed. Then he walked north, ran his trap lines in under an hour, came back with 2 small animals that he did not recognize but that smelled like food when cooked. He boiled them over the fire. He ate one and offered pieces of the other to Pip and Flint. Pip took the food immediately, eating with a desperate focus that made Garrett think it had been several days since the hatchlings had eaten anything at all. Flint waited until Garrett looked away before eating. This became the rhythm of his days. Traps in the morning. Firewood collected before afternoon. Food prepared, divided, shared. Medkit checks on Pip, who was still weaker than it should be and needed monitoring. Watching Flint, who moved more each day and had begun exploring the edges of the nest with the careful curiosity of a creature built to eventually be something very large and very dangerous. On the 7th night, the Skrell came. Garrett had heard about Skrell from other exiles in the early weeks. Pack hunters, low to the ground, fast, with hard shells along their backs that made them difficult to cut. They hunted by smell, mostly at night, and they were bold enough to attack things much larger than themselves when they moved in numbers. He had set tripwire alarms, but he had not set them far enough out. He woke to the clatter of rocks and was on his feet before he was fully conscious, blade in hand, fire starter in his other fist, throwing a thin beam of light across the valley floor. There were 4 of them. They were about the size of large dogs, low-slung, with pale compound eyes that caught the light and threw it back in a flat silver gleam. They had already passed the trip line. 2 were moving toward the nest. 1 was circling left. 1 had stopped and was watching Garrett. Garrett did not wait. He went straight at the 2 moving toward the nest, shouting, a hard, sharp sound that he knew from experience could freeze an animal for half a second. It froze the Skrell for just long enough. He drove his blade into the first one behind the head joint where the shell did not cover, and it dropped. He kicked the second one hard enough to send it skidding back across the rock floor. It scrambled up and he went after it before it could recover, and that one dropped too. The circling one hit him from the left. It caught him across the forearm. Not deep, but the claws dragged and it burned immediately. He spun, got his arm free and put the blade in the right place. The 4th one, the one that had been watching him, ran. Garrett stood in the middle of the valley breathing hard with his forearm dripping and his heartbeat loud in his ears. Pip was pressed against the far wall of the nest, making a low sound. Flint was completely still, watching him with those careful eyes. The egg was untouched. He sat down on the ground and wrapped his arm with a bandage from the medkit, pulling it tight with his teeth. After that, he reworked all the trip lines. He pushed them further out, added more rocks, added hanging pieces of metal he stripped from his pack buckles so they would make more noise. He dug a shallow trench across the main entry point and lined it with sharpened sticks. He was not trying to build a fortress. He was trying to buy himself seconds, enough warning to be on his feet before they reached the nest. The Skrell came back 3 more times over the next 2 weeks. Each time there were more of them. Each time Garrett drove them back. Sometimes clean, sometimes with new cuts on his arms or hands, once with a bad gash along his left side where one had gotten around him in the dark. He treated his own wounds without much drama, cleaned them, wrapped them, and kept moving. He was eating less than he needed. He was sleeping less than he needed. His face had gone hollow in the cheeks and his hands had a slight tremor in the mornings that went away after he had been moving for an hour. He was aware of all of this in a clinical way, the way a soldier tracks damage in the field. He noted it. He adjusted what he could. He kept going. Pip had begun following him around the valley during the day, trailing about 3 steps behind him wherever he went, stopping when he stopped, watching what he watched. It was so consistent that Garrett started talking to it while he worked, explaining what he was doing in a low, steady voice. Setting the trip line here because the rock gives them cover on the approach from this side. Collecting the driest plant matter for the night fires because it burns longer. He was not sure how much Pip understood. He was not sure it mattered. Flint stayed closer to the nest but had started making a short low sound when Garrett returned from his trap runs, a kind of greeting sound that Flint clearly did not intend as a greeting and would have denied if asked. The egg stayed sealed and warm. Every morning the sun came up gray over the ridge. Every morning Garrett got up, wrapped whatever needed wrapping, ate whatever there was to eat, and put himself back between the hatchlings and the valley entrance. He did not think about whether it was worth it. He just kept standing up. Garrett almost missed it. He had been awake most of the night dealing with another Skrell probe along the eastern entry of the valley, not a full attack, just 2 scouts testing the perimeter, which in some ways was worse because it meant the pack was learning his defenses. He had driven them off with noise and fire, reset 2 of the trip lines they had disturbed, and then sat with his back against the nest wall until the sky started to lighten. By the time the gray morning light came over the ridge, he was running entirely on habit and stubbornness, which at this point were the 2 most reliable things he had left. He had fallen asleep sitting up against the nest wall with his blade across his knees. He woke to a sound he had not heard before. It was small, a faint cracking like someone pressing a thumbnail into dry clay. Quiet enough that in any other circumstance he would have slept through it. But 20 years of soldiering had wired his brain to notice things that were different, and this sound was different. He opened his eyes and looked immediately at the center of the nest. The egg was moving. Not much. Just a faint tremor along one side like something inside was pressing outward and testing the resistance. Then the cracking sound again, and a thin dark line appeared near the top of the egg, a fracture running about 4 centimeters across the upper surface. Garrett was on his feet and at the nest edge in 2 steps, fully awake now. He did not touch it. He had no idea whether touching it would help or hurt, and his general principle with things he did not understand was to watch first and act later. He crouched at the nest edge with his forearms on his knees and watched. Pip appeared at his left shoulder, small head extended, watching the egg with the same focused attention it gave everything Garrett paid attention to. Flint drifted over from the far side of the nest and sat a careful distance back, watching in its own still way. The fracture widened. It took a long time. Garrett did not rush it and did not look away. The cracking came in slow waves, a push from inside, a pause, another push. Each push opened the fracture a little more and sent thin lines branching away from it across the shell surface. The shell was thick, a dark charcoal gray that had gone slightly lighter at the fracture edges where the inner surface was exposed. Whatever was inside was working hard. Garrett found himself leaning slightly forward without meaning to. Then a piece of the shell broke away completely, a curved fragment about the size of his palm, and fell into the nest lining. A small head appeared in the gap. Garrett went very still. The hatchling was smaller than Pip and Flint had been when he first found them, which made sense. It had just hatched and they had already had some days on them. Its head was narrow and angular, blinking slowly in the morning light with eyes that were a deep, clear amber color. Its scales were dark at the base, darker even than Flint's, but along the edges, along the tips of every scale running from its head down its neck and spine, there was silver. Not gray. Not pale. Silver like the metal, catching the thin morning light and throwing it back in a faint clean shine. Garrett stared at that for a moment. He had never seen anything like it. In all the intelligence files he had read about Drakri, in all the years he had spent in space and around alien species, he had never seen or heard of a dragon with silver-tipped scales. He did not know what it meant. He filed it away as something to think about later and focused on what was in front of him. The hatchling finished breaking out of the shell over the next 10 minutes, pushing the pieces away with small determined movements until it was free. It was wet from the egg and shaking slightly, not from cold he thought but from the effort. It sat in the broken shell pieces and breathed, gathering itself, the silver tips of its scales catching light with every small movement. Then it looked up. It looked directly at Garrett. Not at Pip, who was right there at the nest edge making small sounds. Not at Flint, who was a member of its own kind sitting 3 meters away. It looked at Garrett, the tired, hollow-cheeked, rough-bearded human crouched at the edge of its nest, and it held that look with an attention and a focus that did not seem like something a creature minutes old should be capable of. Garrett looked back at it. "Hello," he said quietly. The hatchling made a sound, a single short note, high and clear, and then it walked across the nest floor directly to Garrett on legs that were still figuring out how to work properly, stumbling twice on the broken shell pieces, and put its small silver-edged head against his hand. Garrett did not move his hand. He let it stay there. He named it Wren. The name came the same way Pip and Flint had come, not from thinking about it, just from looking at the creature and knowing. Wren. Small and new and somehow already completely certain about things. What followed over the next several days made one thing very clear. Wren had decided that Garrett was its person, and that was the end of the discussion. It slept on his chest. Not near him, not beside him. On him, specifically, with its small body arranged along his sternum and its head tucked under his chin. The first night it did this, Garrett lay very still for a long time, staring up at the valley sky, listening to the small steady breathing on his chest and the faint warm weight of it. He had slept alone for 4 months and before that in military bunks surrounded by other soldiers. This was different from both of those things. He did not examine the difference too closely. He just went to sleep. Ren followed his voice. If Garrett spoke from across the valley, Ren's head turned immediately toward the sound. If Garrett moved away from the nest, Ren followed, navigating the rocky ground with increasing confidence each day, the silver scale tips flashing with every step. If Garrett sat down, Ren climbed onto his lap. If Garrett stood up too quickly, Ren made a sharp disapproving sound that Pip had already learned to treat as a general alarm. Flint watched all of this with an expression that was difficult to read and did not comment. Garrett was glad to have something new to focus on, because the truth was that he was not doing well physically. The gash along his left side from the Skrell attack 2 weeks before had not closed properly. It had healed at the surface, but there was heat and tenderness underneath that suggested something had not gone right. He was rationing food more strictly now, down to 1 proper meal a day in small amounts the rest of the time. He was thin in a way that went past lean into something more concerning, and he knew it. His hands trembled in the mornings for longer now before the shaking settled. He kept this information to himself, which was easy since there was no one to tell. On the 23rd day after Ren hatched, Garrett was asleep in the middle of the afternoon, something he had started allowing himself to do in daylight when the valley was quiet and the trip lines were set, with Ren on his chest and Pip curled against his left side. Flint was somewhere at the edge of his awareness, moving along the valley wall in its slow exploratory way. He did not hear the ship. He heard Flint. Flint made a sound it had never made before, a low resonant sound that came up from somewhere deep in its chest and rolled across the valley floor like a physical thing. Garrett was awake and sitting up in less than a second, one hand catching Ren before it slid off his chest, the other finding his blade. He looked up. The ship was already landed at the wide end of the valley. It was large, military configuration, dark plating, no coalition markings. Drackery. The landing ramp was already down and figures were moving down it, tall, armored, moving with the precise, unhurried pace of soldiers who were very good at what they did and knew it. There were 12 of them. They fanned out across the valley floor and stopped when they saw him. There was a pause, a long one, where nothing happened and nobody moved. Garrett sat in the dirt of a dragon nest on a forgotten exile planet, a silver-tipped hatchling held carefully against his chest, 2 other young dragons at his sides, looking at 12 Drackery honor guard soldiers looking at him. One of the soldiers in the center, taller than the others with different marks on the chest plate, said something in Drackery that Garrett did not understand. Then she said nothing else. She just looked at the Silverborn sleeping quietly against the chest of the wounded, starving, unbothered human in the dirt. And for a long moment, not one of her soldiers moved or spoke either. The tall Drackery in the center spoke first. Her voice was low and controlled, the kind of voice that was used to giving orders and having them followed without question. She spoke in Drackery, which Garrett did not understand, but the tone was clear enough. It was the tone of someone who had arrived somewhere they considered theirs and found something unexpected in it. Garrett stood up slowly. He did it carefully, keeping Ren supported against his chest with one arm, not making any sudden movements. Not because he was afraid, he had moved past most kinds of fear somewhere around the 3rd Skrell attack, but because he had 12 armed soldiers in front of him and he was not interested in being misread. He got to his feet, straightened his back despite the pull of the wound along his left side and stood. Pip pressed against his right leg. Flint moved up beside the nest and stopped, watching. The tall Drackery spoke again. Still Drackery. Still the same controlled tone, but with a harder edge now. Garrett looked at her steadily and said, "I don't speak your language. I'm going to assume you said something like, 'Who are you and what are you doing here?'" Silence. One of the soldiers behind her shifted slightly. She raised one hand without looking back and the soldier went still again. She studied him for a long moment, the worn armor, the wrapped wounds, the hollow face, the blade at his hip that he had not reached for, the silver-tipped hatchling held carefully and without apparent effort against his chest. Her eyes stayed on Ren for several seconds. Something moved in her expression that Garrett could not name. Then she said in slow and careful standard, with an accent that shaped the words into something almost unfamiliar, "You are human." "Yes," Garrett said. "This is sacred Drackery ground." "I know," Garrett said. "I figured that out from the carvings on the valley wall. I can leave if you want me to. But I'm not leaving until I know they're going to be all right." He looked down at Ren, then toward Pip and Flint. They were alone. The mother was gone. "I stayed." Another long silence. The commander, because that was clearly what she was, walked forward. Her soldiers did not follow, staying in their fanned-out positions near the ship. She crossed the valley floor until she was about 4 meters from Garrett and stopped there, looking at him with an expression that had gone from hard to something more careful. "I am Elder Sereth," she said. Commander of the Drackery Honor Guard, 4th Fleet. Garrett gave her a small nod. Garrett. Former soldier. Currently nobody. Sareth looked at Ren again. The hatchling had woken during the conversation and was watching her with its clear amber eyes, making no move toward her. Its silver-tipped scales caught the afternoon light with every small breath. Something in Sareth's posture changed. It was a very small change. A slight adjustment in the set of her shoulders, a shift in how she was holding herself. Garrett, who had spent 20 years reading people in high-pressure situations, noticed it immediately. Whatever Ren was, it meant something significant to these people. More significant than he had understood. Sareth spoke briefly in Drackery over her shoulder. One of her soldiers responded. She turned back to Garrett. The Silverborn will come with us, she said. All 3 hatchlings will come with us. This is not a discussion. Ren made a short sharp sound and pressed harder against Garrett's chest. Sareth stopped. She looked at Ren. Then at Garrett. Then at Ren again. The hatchling had its head turned away from her and toward Garrett's neck, which was about as clear a statement of preference as a creature that young could make. He can stay where he is for now, Garrett said quietly. He'll let you know when he's ready. Sareth did not respond to that. But she did not reach for Ren either. The afternoon passed in an uneasy quiet. Sareth's soldiers set up a small camp near their ship. 2 of them approached the nest area and were stopped, politely but completely, by Garrett stepping into their path without raising his voice or his hands. He explained in simple language that the hatchlings were not comfortable with strangers yet and that a slow approach would work better than a direct one. The soldiers looked at Sareth. Sareth looked at Garrett for a long moment and then told her soldiers to hold back. Garrett spent the afternoon the way he spent every afternoon, checking the trip lines, collecting firewood for the night fires, preparing what food he had. Sareth watched him do all of this from a distance, saying nothing. Her soldiers watched too. Garrett could feel their attention the way you feel weather coming, a pressure in the air that did not go away. At one point, while he was resetting a trip line near the eastern entry, one of the younger soldiers came to stand nearby and watched him work. Garrett showed him how the line connected to the rock stack and what angle gave the most noise for the least movement. The soldier watched with what seemed like genuine interest. They had no shared language, but the mechanics were clear enough. When the sun went down and Garrett lit the ring of fires around the nest, Sareth came to sit at a distance from them and watched. You have done this every night? She asked. Since the first night, Garrett said. She was quiet for a while. Then, the wound on your side. It has not healed correctly. No, Garrett agreed. You continued anyway. Yes. She did not say anything else about it. The attack came 3 hours after dark. Garrett heard it before the trip lines went, a sound under the wind, a low collective movement that he had learned to recognize over weeks of listening for it. He was on his feet before the first rock clatter sounded, blade out, moving toward the eastern entry. But this time it was not 4 Skrell. It was not 6. The Alpha came through first. It was enormous, twice the size of any Skrell he had seen before, with a shell that was darker and thicker and a way of moving that was completely different from the pack members. It did not scramble or dart. It moved with a slow, heavy confidence, like something that had never learned to be afraid. Behind it, through the eastern entry and beginning to probe the southern wall too, came the pack. Garrett counted fast, 12, 15 still coming. The Drackery soldiers were moving, coming up from the camp with weapons drawn, fanning out across the valley floor. The Alpha ignored all of them. It had fixed on the nest. Its pale compound eyes were on the nest and it was moving toward it in that slow heavy way, and it was not going to be turned by noise or fire or the presence of soldiers it had not learned to fear yet. Garrett understood the situation in about 2 seconds. The soldiers were good. They would handle the pack. But the Alpha was already past the point where shouting and fire would stop it, and it was heading straight for Pip and Flint and Ren, and the only thing between it and the nest was open ground. Garrett ran toward the Alpha. Not away from it. Toward it. He angled his run to the left of the nest, cutting across the Alpha's path, and when it turned its head toward him he shouted, a hard, carrying sound, and waved his blade arm wide, making himself as large and loud and present as possible. The Alpha turned. It was exactly what he needed it to do and exactly what he had known would hurt. It came at him fast, faster than the pack members moved, closing the ground between them in a way that did not leave him much room. He got his blade up and managed to cut along its left foreleg, but the weight of it hit him before he could get clear. A massive sideways impact from its shoulder that lifted him off his feet and put him hard into the rock wall of the valley. He hit the wall back first and came down to one knee, the breath knocked completely out of him, a bright tearing pain along his left side where the old wound had just gotten worse. His blade was still in his hand. He kept it in his hand. The Alpha turned back toward him and came again. Garrett drove the blade up under the front edge of its shell where there was no plate, putting everything he had left into it and held it there. The Alpha came down. Garrett went down under it, one arm braced and did not let go of the blade. Then it was still. He pushed it off him slowly and got back to one knee, breathing in hard, careful pulls. The valley was quieter now. The pack was broken, the soldiers had dealt with them efficiently. He could hear boots on rock, movement, the sound of the fight winding down. He looked at the nest. Pip, Flint, and Wren, untouched, pressed together at the center, all eyes on him. He raised one hand toward them briefly. Still here. Then he became aware that the valley had gone very quiet. All of Saratha's soldiers had stopped moving. They were standing in their positions across the valley floor, weapons lowered, looking at him. Not at the dead Alpha. At him. At the blade still in his hand and the blood on his side and the completely steady way he was meeting their eyes from one knee in the dirt. Sarath stood closest. She was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not the careful authority from the afternoon, not the controlled assessment. Something older than both of those things. She said something in Dracari. Very quietly. Not to Garrett, to her soldiers. Every single one of them straightened. And then, in unison, without a word from anyone, they bowed. Garrett looked at them all for a moment. Then he turned and checked on the hatchlings because that was what needed doing next. The Dracari medic worked quickly. She was good at her job. Garrett could tell that much from watching her move, the efficiency of it, nothing wasted. She had her kit open and was assessing the damage on his left side within minutes of the Alpha going down, her hands careful and precise. She cleaned the wound, applied something from a dark container that stopped the bleeding faster than anything in Garrett's medkit could have managed, and wrapped it in a way that held everything firmly in place. Then she sat back and looked at Sarath. She spoke in Dracari. Quietly. The kind of quiet that people use when the information they are delivering is not good and they are being careful about who hears it. Sarath listened without expression. Then she asked a short question. The medic answered with a single word and looked at the ground. Garrett watched this exchange from where he was sitting against the nest wall. He did not need to speak Dracari to understand the shape of it. He had been in enough field situations to know what a medic looked like when the answer was not fixable. He had seen that particular stillness before, on other faces in other places. He recognized it the way you recognize weather. He looked down at his left side, at the clean tight wrapping the medic had applied, and he understood. Sarath came and sat beside him. She did not say anything immediately. She sat in the way that people sit when they are choosing their words, and Garrett gave her the time to find them. Wren had climbed back onto his chest the moment he had settled against the nest wall, arranged in its usual position with its head tucked close. Pip was pressed against his right side, warm and solid. Flint had come too, quietly without announcement, the way Flint did everything, and was sitting against his left, close enough that Garrett could feel the steady warmth of it through his arm. He was surrounded on three sides by sleeping and half-sleeping dragon hatchlings, and it occurred to him, in a distant and uncomplicated way, that there were worse situations to be in. The internal damage is significant, Sarath said finally. The Alpha's impact, together with the wound that had already not healed, it is beyond what our medicine can repair in a human body. Our biology is different enough that what we have could cause additional harm. She paused. We have sent a signal for a human medical vessel. The nearest one is responding. Garrett nodded slowly. How long? He asked. Sarath was quiet for just a moment too long. It will not arrive in time, he said. Not a question. No, Sarath said. I am sorry. Garrett looked out across the valley. The fires were still burning in their ring around the nest, low and steady. The sky above the valley walls was very clear. More stars visible than usual, the way the sky sometimes got after the wind dropped. He had noticed over the past months that Vorn 9 had remarkable stars if you caught it on a still night. He had not had many still nights. All right, he said. Sarath looked at him. You are not, she paused, searching for the word. You are not frightened. I've had time to get used to the idea, Garrett said. I knew the wound on my side wasn't right. I knew it for a while. He shifted slightly, careful not to disturb Wren. I just needed it to hold long enough. Long enough for what? He looked at the three hatchlings around him. Long enough for someone to come. Sarath was quiet for a moment. One of her soldiers had built up the fire nearest to them without being asked, adding wood carefully and quietly, and the warmth of it reached them in steady waves. I want to ask you something, Sarath said. And I want you to know that I am not asking as a commander. I am asking because I want to understand. Go ahead, Garrett said. Why did you stay? She said it simply and directly. This was not your nest. These are not your hatchlings. They are not even your species. You were exiled here, abandoned here, with nothing. You had no obligation to any of this. You could have walked past that valley and survived longer on your own without the wounds and the lost food and the lost sleep. She paused. So why did you stay? Garrett did not answer immediately. He looked at Pip sleeping against his side. He looked at Flint, who was not quite asleep, whose eye he could see catching the firelight in a thin amber line. He looked at Wren, small and warm and breathing steadily on his chest, the silver-tipped scales rising and falling with every breath. Because they were alone, he said. And I know what that feels like. Sareth said nothing. I don't mean alone like, temporarily alone, Garrett said. I mean the kind of alone where nobody is coming. Where whatever decision put you in that position has already been made by someone else, and the people who made it have moved on and are not thinking about you anymore. He paused. I know what it is to be in a situation you didn't choose with nobody coming to help. I looked at them in that nest and I knew. So I stayed. The fire crackled quietly. Somewhere on the far side of the valley, one of the soldiers was moving through a routine check of the perimeter, boots soft on the rock. You were exiled, Sareth said. For refusing an order. Yes. The order was to fire on civilians. Yes. Sareth looked at him for a long time. On my world, she said slowly, there is a word for what you did tonight with the Alpha. In your language the closest translation would be something like, the shield price. It describes a specific act. When a warrior deliberately draws a killing strike toward themselves and away from those they are protecting. She paused. It is considered the highest expression of our warrior code. In our history it has only ever been performed by those we consider truly honored. Commanders. Elders. Those who have given everything. Garrett glanced at her. I just didn't want it to reach the nest. I know, Sareth said. That is exactly what makes it what it is. The hours moved in the way hours move when you are aware they are finite, slowly, and with a weight to each one. Sareth stayed beside him. She did not leave to sleep, did not move to her ship, did not perform the functions of command that were surely waiting for her attention. She simply stayed, which Garrett understood was a choice and appreciated without saying so. They talked sometimes. Not about large things, about small ones. Sareth told him something about the valley, about what the carvings on the wall meant, about why the Drackery considered certain nesting sites sacred and how long this particular valley had been known to her people. Garrett told her about the trap lines, about which approach the Skrell preferred and at what time of night, about the way Pip had first eaten from his hand on the fourth day. Small things. Real things. At one point Sareth said, the Silverborn. Wren. She said the name carefully as if learning the shape of it. In our history, a Silverborn has never bonded to a non-Drackery. There are those among my people who will not understand it. What will you tell them? Garrett asked. The truth, Sareth said. That I watched it happen and I do not fully understand it either. But that some things do not require understanding in order to be real. Garrett looked at Wren. He just decided, he said. First morning. Walked right over. Yes, Sareth said quietly. They know things we don't. The sky above the valley began to change somewhere in the deep part of the night. The stars fading, the blackness becoming something slightly less absolute, the first suggestion of the gray pre-dawn light beginning along the top of the eastern ridge. Garrett noticed it in the way he noticed most things now, distantly, clearly, without urgency. He was very tired. Not the tired of a bad night, the deeper kind. Sareth, he said. Yes. Make sure Pip eats properly. She gets stubborn about it sometimes, waits until you look away. You have to leave the food and walk off for a minute. Sareth's voice was steady when she answered. I will make sure. Flint will be fine. Flint is always fine. He paused. Just give him space and let him come to you. He will. All right. And Wren? He stopped. His hand rested on Wren's small back, feeling the steady warmth of it, the rise and fall. Wren will tell you what he needs. Just listen. I will listen, Sareth said. Garrett closed his eyes. The sun came up over the eastern ridge the way it always did on Vorn 9, gray first, then a thin cold gold that moved slowly down the valley walls and across the floor. It reached the nest and touched it gently, the way light touches things that have been waiting for it. Wren was on his chest. Pip was pressed to his right side. Flint was against his left, close and warm and still. Behind them, in a wide silent formation, every member of the Dracari Honor Guard stood at full attention. And every single one of them bowed. Sareth did not ask permission. She did not send a request to the Dracari Council or file a report and wait for a response. She made the decision standing in that valley on Vorin 9 in the early morning light, with the sun just reaching the nest and 12 of her soldiers still bowed around a man who had died in the dirt of a planet that had tried to make him disappear. She made it the way she made all her important decisions. Quietly, completely, with no uncertainty about it. Garrett would come home with them. She gave the order in a few short words and her soldiers moved without question. They prepared him carefully and with full ceremony, the same ceremony they would have used for one of their own fallen commanders. 2 of her soldiers removed their outer ceremonial wrappings and used them as a covering. They moved slowly and with great care. Nobody rushed. Nobody spoke above a low murmur. Ren would not leave his side. The young Silverborn walked alongside them the entire way to the ship, silver-tipped scales catching the morning light with every step, amber eyes fixed on Garrett with an attention that did not waver. When they carried Garrett up the ramp and into the ship, Ren followed. When they placed him in the ship's ceremonial bay, Ren curled beside him and stayed there for the entire journey, and not one of Saratha's soldiers suggested that the Silverborn should move. Pip and Flint came aboard too, both of them quieter than Garrett had ever seen them, moving through the unfamiliar ship with the careful attention of young creatures in a new place. Flint explored slowly along the walls. Pip stayed close to Ren. The ship left Vorin 9 without ceremony. Nobody on the planet noticed. Nobody had noticed Garrett arriving either. That was the point of exile planets. Things came and went from them and the rest of the galaxy looked elsewhere. But the galaxy would notice eventually. It always did when the Dracari decided something mattered. The journey to Dracariel Prime took 11 days. During those 11 days, Sareth wrote her report. She was thorough and exact, the way she was thorough and exact about everything, and she left nothing out. She wrote about arriving on Vorin 9 and finding the nest. She wrote about Garrett, his condition, his wounds, his makeshift camp, his trap lines, the fire rings around the egg, the weeks of solo fighting against Skrell packs. She wrote about the shield price. She wrote about what the medic had said and what Garrett had answered when she asked him why he stayed. She wrote his words exactly as he had said them. Because they were alone. And I know what that feels like. She sent the report ahead of the ship so that by the time they arrived, the council had already read it. She had served long enough to know how councils worked. They needed time to absorb things before they were asked to decide on them. What she was going to ask them to decide on was not a small thing. They landed on Dracariel Prime on a clear morning. The council met 2 days later. Sareth stood before them and gave her account in person, which was not required but which she had decided was necessary. She spoke for a long time. She answered their questions directly. When one council member suggested that honoring a human in the Valley of Shields was without precedent and therefore inadvisable, Sareth said very calmly that what Garrett had done was also without precedent, and that the two facts were connected. The council deliberated for 4 hours. They voted unanimously. The burial took place 1 week after landing, in the Valley of Shields on the southern continent of Dracariel Prime. The valley was old, ancient, in the way that only places that have been considered sacred for thousands of years become ancient. The stone walls were carved from top to bottom with names and symbols, every name a warrior who had given everything. The air in the valley was still and cool and carried a quality of quiet that felt intentional, like the valley itself was paying attention. Every member of Saratha's honor guard attended in full ceremonial armor. 3 other honor guard units had asked permission to attend and had been granted it. Representatives from 6 Dracari fleet commands stood in formation along the valley walls. There were more people present than had attended any burial in the Valley of Shields in 40 years. Ren stood at the head of the procession. A Silverborn leading a burial procession was something so rare that several of the older soldiers present had never seen it in their lifetimes. Ren was still young, still growing, still finding the full size that a Silverborn would eventually reach, but there was nothing uncertain about the way he walked. He walked with the complete calm of a creature that knew exactly where it was and exactly why it was there. His silver-tipped scales had brightened as he grew, catching the valley light in clean flashes with every step. Garrett's name was carved into the wall of the honored dead 3 days after the burial. The stonemason who did the carving had been working on that wall for 30 years. She carved names in Dracari script. She always had, for every name on that wall going back through all her years of work. For Garrett she carved his name in Dracari script and then, beneath it, in human standard, the same name again. She had never done that before. She did it because it seemed right that anyone who came from his people and stood in that valley should be able to read it without needing a translation. Word spread the way word spreads when something genuinely unexpected has happened. It started among the Dracari fleets, soldiers talking to soldiers, the story of what happened on Voron 9 moving from ship to ship through the normal channels that military information travels. Then it reached the Dracari civilian population, and from there it crossed into the broader networks of galactic communication that connected the various species of settled space. It moved slowly at first and then faster, the way a true story moves when it finds people who are ready to hear it. Most species who heard it said some version of the same thing, that they had not known humans were capable of that. Not the fighting which most species had always known about. The other part. The staying. The building of fire rings around a stranger's egg in the dark. The feeding of creatures that were not his. The drawing of a killing strike toward himself so that something small and sleeping would not be touched. The Terran Coalition heard it too. There were meetings. There were discussions about how the story reflected on the coalition itself, on the decision to exile Garrett, on the charges that had been filed against him in that gray room on that gray ship. Eventually, after enough meetings and enough discussions, a formal document was produced. It cleared Garrett's name completely. It reversed his exile. It restored his rank posthumously and added a commendation that used careful language to say, without quite admitting fault, that his actions on Voron 9 had demonstrated the highest qualities of a coalition soldier. Sareth, when she was informed of this document, said nothing for a long moment. Then she said that it was good they had done it even now, even late. She meant it. But she also knew that the Dracari had already said what needed to be said, in stone, in the Valley of Shields, in 2 languages. Pip and Flint grew up on Dracario Prime, in a territory set aside for them near the Valley of Shields. They were not the same as Ren. They did not carry the Silverborn bloodline, did not carry the weight of sacred significance that followed Ren everywhere he went. But they were known, and they were respected, and the soldiers who cared for their territory treated them with a particular combination of care and caution that very large creatures with long memories deserve. Pip remained exactly what she had always been, quick, direct, demanding, taking food from hands with the same decisive energy she had shown as a hatchling. Flint remained Flint, watchful, reserved, arriving in his own time and on his own terms. They both remembered Garrett. That was clear, in the way it is clear with creatures who cannot say the words but show the truth of something in other ways. When new soldiers came to their territory who did not know the story, Pip would lead them, eventually after her own assessment of whether they deserved it, to the memorial marker near the valley. Flint would sometimes simply sit beside the marker for long periods of time, doing nothing, looking at nothing in particular. Soldiers who worked in the territory learned to leave him alone when he did this. Ren grew into everything a Silverborn was supposed to be and several things nobody had expected. He was large, larger than most adult Dracari, which was saying something. His silver scale tips had spread as he aged, so that by the time he reached his full size he was more silver than dark, catching light from every angle and throwing it in all directions when he moved. He had a presence that the Dracari described using a word that translated roughly as something that makes the air feel different when it enters a room. He sat on 2 advisory councils. Younger dragons sought him out. His opinion was requested on matters of significance. He wore a piece of Garrett's old armor on his chest plate every day. It was a small piece, a section of the shoulder plate, scratched and worn, with the faded marks where the coalition insignia had been scraped off. A Dracari craftsman had set it into a mount that kept it secure against Ren's ceremonial chest plate. Ren had asked for this himself in the first year, before he had even grown enough to need a ceremonial chest plate. He had carried the piece of armor carefully until the mount was ready, and he had never gone without it since. People asked him about it sometimes. Visitors, dignitaries, younger dragons who did not know the story yet. Ren would tell them. He told it simply and without decoration the same way every time. A man on a cold planet. A nest that was not his. A fire built every night around an egg that was not his. A blade held steady through weeks of darkness and hunger and wounds that did not heal. He told it the way Garrett had done things, without drama, without the need to make it larger than it was. It was already large enough. Every year, on the same date, Ren flew to Voron 9. The planet had not changed. It was still gray and cold and forgotten, the wind still coming hard off the northern flats, the sky still failing to be properly blue. The hidden valley was still there, the rock walls still carved with old Dracari symbols, the nest structure still present though weathered now by years without maintenance. Ren would land at the wide end of the valley, the same place the honor guard ship had landed all those years ago, and he would walk across the valley floor to the place near the nest wall where Garrett had slept. He would curl around that spot. He would stay for a while, sometimes an hour, sometimes most of a day depending on the year and what he needed. The valley was quiet. The wind moved over the ridge and down the walls and across the floor the way it had always moved. The stars, when night came, were remarkable. Before he left he would speak. Just once, just a few words, in Dracari, spoken quietly into the empty air of the valley, the way you speak to someone you know can no longer hear you, but you speak to them anyway because the saying of it matters. The word he always ended with was the Dracari word for father. On Dracariel Prime, carved in stone on the wall of the honored dead, in 2 languages the name remained. Not the rank. Not the unit. Not the commendation that came too late from the people who had thrown him away. Just the name. Just Garrett. And every hatchling born on Dracariel Prime, before they learned to fly, before they learned the names of the great fleet commanders or the honored elders or the heroes of 100 battles across 100 years, they learned his name first. A human name. A simple one. The one who stayed.